Microsoft's 7.2B mobile disaster, the Windows Phone catastrophe. In the summer of 2013, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer stood before investors and announced what he called a transformative acquisition that would reshape the mobile industry forever. Microsoft was purchasing Nokia's entire mobile phone business for a staggering $7.2 billion, making it one of the largest tech acquisitions in history at that time. Just 24 months later, his successor Satya Nadella would write off nearly the entire investment, laying off 18,000 employees and effectively admitting that Microsoft had just burned through enough money to fund a small country's annual budget. This wasn't just a business miscalculation. It was a spectacular corporate catastrophe that revealed how even tech giants could completely misread the mobile revolution that was reshaping the entire technology landscape. The roots of this disaster stretch back to 2010, when Microsoft realized they were catastrophically late to the smartphone party. While Apple's iPhone had already redefined what consumers expected from mobile devices, and Google's Android was rapidly gaining market share by partnering with multiple manufacturers, Microsoft was still clinging to their ancient Windows mobile platform that felt like using a desktop computer with a tiny screen. Their Windows mobile operating system had peaked at just 5% market share in 2009 and was hemorrhaging users to more intuitive alternatives. Steve Ballmer, who had famously laughed off the iPhone in 2007 by claiming nobody would buy a $500 phone without a keyboard, finally acknowledged that Microsoft needed to completely reinvent their mobile strategy. The company made the decision to scrap Windows Mobile entirely and build Windows Phone 7 from the ground up, featuring a radically different tile-based interface they called Metro that bore no resemblance to traditional smartphone layouts. When Windows Phone 7 launched in October 2010, Microsoft had partnered with multiple manufacturers, including HTC, Samsung, and LG, but the most significant partnership was with Nokia, the Finnish company that had once dominated the mobile phone industry, but was now struggling to remain relevant in the smartphone era. Nokia's decision to embrace Windows Phone was itself born from desperation and marked one of the most controversial strategic pivots in tech history. In February 2011, Nokia's new CEO Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, sent a company-wide memo that became known as the Burning Platform Memo, where he declared that Nokia was standing on a burning oil platform and needed to make dramatic changes to survive. Elop announced that Nokia would abandon their own Symbian operating system, which still powered the majority of their smartphones, and instead adopt Windows Phone as their primary smartphone platform. This decision was shocking because Nokia had been the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer for over a decade, shipping 461 million phones in 2010 alone, and Symbian still commanded significant market share in many international markets. The announcement immediately triggered what industry analysts called the Osborne effect, where sales of existing Nokia smartphones plummeted as consumers waited for the new Windows Phone devices, creating a massive revenue gap that lasted for months. Critics accused Elop of being a Trojan horse planted by Microsoft to sabotage Nokia from within, though both companies vehemently denied these allegations. Nokia's first Windows Phone device, the Lumia 800, didn't launch until November 2011, giving competitors like Samsung and Apple nearly a full year to capture Nokia's displaced customers. Despite Microsoft and Nokia's combined efforts, Windows Phone faced enormous challenges that became apparent almost immediately after launch. The platform suffered from a severe app gap that never closed throughout its entire existence. While Apple's App Store contained over 500,000 applications by 2012 and Google Play offered similar numbers, Windows Phone's App Store struggled to reach even 100,000 apps, and many of these were low-quality applications that simply filled space rather than providing genuine utility. Major applications that smartphone users considered essential were either completely absent or arrived years after their iOS and Android counterparts. Instagram didn't launch on Windows Phone until 2013, 3 years after becoming a cultural phenomenon on other platforms. Snapchat never released an official Windows Phone app at all, despite repeated pleas from Microsoft executives and even personal appeals from company leadership. YouTube was another notorious absence, with Google refusing to develop an official app and even blocking Microsoft's attempts to create their own YouTube client. The app situation created a vicious cycle, where consumers avoided Windows Phone because it lacked the applications they wanted, which in turn made developers even less likely to invest resources in the platform due to its small user base. Microsoft attempted to address this by paying developers to create Windows Phone versions of popular apps and even built some major applications themselves, but these efforts never succeeded in closing the fundamental app gap that plagued the platform. The user interface philosophy behind Windows Phone, while innovative and visually distinctive, proved to be both a strength and a fatal weakness. Microsoft's Metro design language featured large, colorful tiles that could display live information and created an interface that looked completely different from the icon-based layouts of iOS and Android. The tile system was genuinely innovative, allowing users to see weather updates, social media posts, and email previews directly on their home screen without opening individual applications. Many technology reviewers praised Windows Phone's interface as more intuitive and visually appealing than its competitors, with several major publications naming Windows Phone devices among the best-designed smartphones of their respective years. However, this same distinctiveness became a barrier to adoption because consumers who were already familiar with iOS or Android found Windows Phone's navigation and interaction patterns confusing and counterintuitive. The learning curve required to switch from an iPhone or Android device to Windows Phone was significant enough that many users simply chose to stick with what they already knew. Microsoft also made several controversial decisions about Windows Phone's capabilities that frustrated potential users. The operating system initially lacked support for features that Android and iOS users took for granted, including custom ringtones, multitasking, and even basic functions like copy and paste, which wasn't added until Windows Phone 7.5 was released in 2011. Nokia's hardware engineering remained exceptional throughout the Windows Phone era, producing devices that were often superior to their Android and iOS competitors in build quality, camera performance, and innovative features. The Nokia Lumia 920, released in 2012, featured wireless charging capability years before it became standard on other smartphones and included a camera system with optical image stabilization that produced remarkably stable video and clear low-light photographs. Nokia's PureView camera technology, first introduced in the Lumia 1020, featured a 41-megapixel sensor that allowed users to zoom into photos without losing detail, a capability that wouldn't appear in mainstream smartphones for several more years. The Lumia line consistently received praise from technology journalists for solid construction, excellent cameras, and innovative features like super-sensitive touchscreens that could be operated while wearing gloves. Nokia also experimented with unique materials and colors, offering Lumia devices in bright yellow, red, and blue options at a time when most smartphones only came in black or white. Despite these hardware advantages, exceptional engineering couldn't overcome the fundamental software and ecosystem limitations that prevented Windows Phone from gaining significant market traction. Even Nokia's most innovative devices struggled to attract consumers who prioritized app selection and ecosystem integration over hardware specifications. By 2013, it was clear that the Nokia partnership wasn't delivering the market transformation that either company had hoped for, leading Microsoft to make the fateful decision to acquire Nokia's entire mobile division. Windows Phone's global market share had peaked at just 3.6% in late 2013, and even that modest success was almost entirely due to Nokia's efforts, as other Windows Phone manufacturers like HTC and Samsung had largely abandoned the platform in favor of focusing on their Android devices. Steve Ballmer announced the Nokia acquisition in September 2013, describing it as essential for Microsoft's mobile strategy and comparing it to how Google had acquired Motorola to better integrate hardware and software development. The $7.2 billion price tag included Nokia's smartphone business, patents, mapping services, and approximately 32,000 employees, making it the largest acquisition in Microsoft's history at that time. Industry analysts were immediately skeptical of the deal's logic, pointing out that Microsoft was essentially paying billions to acquire a smartphone business with declining sales and a struggling platform. The acquisition also raised questions about Microsoft's relationships with other potential hardware partners, as companies like HTC and Samsung were understandably reluctant to invest in a platform where they would be competing directly against the operating system's creator. The integration of Nokia into Microsoft proved to be a disaster from almost every perspective, revealing fundamental strategic miscalculations that went far beyond simply overpaying for a declining asset. The acquisition was completed in April 2014, with Nokia's mobile division becoming Microsoft Mobile, but the cultural integration between the two companies was problematic from the beginning. Nokia's engineering-focused culture clashed with Microsoft's software-centric approach, leading to internal conflicts about product direction, development priorities, and resource allocation. Microsoft had assumed that controlling both the hardware and software aspects of Windows Phone would allow them to compete more effectively against Apple's integrated iPhone ecosystem. But the reality was that Microsoft lacked Apple's decades of hardware manufacturing expertise and supply chain management capabilities. The company struggled to achieve the economies of scale that made iPhone production profitable, and Microsoft Mobile's devices often cost more to manufacture than comparable Android phones, while selling for lower prices due to market positioning pressures. Stephen Elop, who had become head of Microsoft's devices division after the acquisition, found himself managing a business unit that was losing money on every phone sold while competing in a market where Windows Phone's share was actually declining despite Microsoft's massive investment. Within just 1 year of completing the Nokia acquisition, it became clear that Microsoft had made a catastrophic strategic error that would require drastic correction. Satya Nadella, who had replaced Steve Ballmer as CEO in February 2014, inherited a mobile strategy that was consuming enormous resources while delivering virtually no positive results. Windows Phone's market share continued to decline throughout 2014 and 2015, falling below 3% globally and approaching statistical irrelevance in key markets like the United States, where it held less than 1% market share. The smartphone industry had consolidated around iOS and Android to such a degree that consumers, developers, and even mobile carriers saw Windows Phone as an unnecessary third option rather than a viable alternative. Microsoft's attempts to reinvigorate the platform with Windows 10 Mobile failed to generate any significant consumer interest, and major manufacturers like Samsung and LG had completely abandoned Windows Phone development. In July 2015, just 15 months after completing the Nokia acquisition, Nadella announced that Microsoft would write off $7.6 billion related to the Nokia purchase and lay off 7,800 employees, primarily from the former Nokia mobile division. This write-off was followed by additional restructuring charges in 2016, when Microsoft laid off another 1,850 employees from its phone business and took an additional $950 million impairment charge. The final chapter of Microsoft's mobile disaster played out over the next 2 years as the company gradually retreated from smartphone manufacturing while attempting to salvage some value from the Nokia acquisition wreckage. Microsoft continued to release new Windows Phone devices through 2016, including the Lumia 950 and 950 XL, but these phones were marketed primarily to business users and developers rather than mainstream consumers. Sales figures for these final Windows Phone devices were so poor that Microsoft stopped reporting them separately, burying the numbers within broader hardware revenue categories. The company's last major attempt to create a mobile success was the Surface Phone project, which was rumored for years but never materialized as Microsoft ultimately decided that the smartphone market had become too mature and consolidated for a new entrant to succeed. By 2017, Microsoft had effectively exited the smartphone hardware business entirely, though Windows 10 Mobile continued to receive security updates for existing users until December 2019. The company pivoted its mobile strategy toward developing applications for iOS and Android, acknowledging that their future lay in providing services across platforms rather than competing directly with Apple and Google in hardware manufacturing. Stephen Elop departed Microsoft in 2015, and most of the former Nokia executives who had joined Microsoft through the acquisition either left the company or moved to other divisions. The Microsoft-Nokia acquisition stands as one of the most expensive corporate failures in technology history, representing a case study in how even experienced technology companies can make catastrophically wrong strategic decisions when facing rapidly evolving markets. The $7.2 billion purchase price, combined with additional write-offs and restructuring costs, ultimately cost Microsoft over $10 billion while failing to establish any meaningful presence in the mobile market. The acquisition's failure stemmed from multiple fundamental miscalculations, including overestimating consumers' willingness to adopt a third mobile platform, underestimating the importance of application ecosystems, and believing that hardware control alone could overcome systemic platform disadvantages. Microsoft's mobile disaster also demonstrated how market timing is crucial in technology, as the company's efforts came too late in the smartphone evolution cycle, when consumers and developers had already committed to iOS and Android. The failure forced Microsoft to fundamentally reconsider its role in the technology industry, ultimately leading to a more successful strategy focused on cloud computing, productivity software, and cross-platform services, rather than attempting to control entire device ecosystems. While Microsoft recovered from this setback and eventually became one of the world's most valuable companies under Satya Nadella's leadership, the Nokia acquisition remains a permanent reminder that even the largest technology companies are not immune to making spectacularly expensive mistakes when they misread market dynamics and consumer preferences.